If I told you that the more you chase him, the less he feels for you, would you believe me? Because in most cases, the thing that destroys attraction is not distance. It is over-effort that removes mystery and respect from the dynamic. And here is what most people never understand. Sometimes, the moment you stop reacting emotionally and start holding your own space is the exact moment his attention starts shifting back toward you in a completely different way. Think about this for a second. Have you ever noticed how someone suddenly becomes more interesting when they are not fully available? Not because they changed who they are, but because your mind starts wondering about them more. Now imagine if the same principle applies in reverse. When you stop over-giving attention, stop over-explaining yourself, and start responding with calm confidence instead of emotional urgency, something in the dynamic shifts. And the real question is not how to control him, but how to stay in a position where you never lose yourself trying. Ladies, gather around. If a man is ignoring you right now, I want you to hear me like I'm speaking about your near future. Because most of the time, I say this with care, not judgment. You are not confused about him. You are just repeating patterns that quietly push him further away. And before you jump to defend him and say he is different or complicated, understand this. He is still a man with a simple emotional structure. When a man pulls back, it usually means something very basic is happening in his mind, not something mysterious. So instead of chasing confusion, you need to understand the psychology behind silence, distance, and delayed replies in a way that helps you stay calm and in control of yourself. Now let's talk about what is actually happening when he ignores your messages. You send something simple, maybe even sweet, like asking about his day, and you wait. He reads it. You know he reads it because people always read what they are curious about. But instead of replying, he delays, or replies later with something short and dry. At the same time, if something else grabs his attention, like a notification, entertainment, or anything that benefits him directly, he responds instantly. This is not about you being less important as a person. It is about priority and effort. Men respond quickly to what feels urgent or rewarding to them, and slowly to what they believe will still be there waiting. Here is where the deeper truth comes in. And it is not always comfortable. A man often ignores a woman not because she is unworthy, but because he believes she is already emotionally available and not going anywhere. In his mind, there is no urgency, so there is no pressure to act quickly. This creates a silent comfort zone in his ego. He starts assuming you will understand, you will wait, and you will stay consistent no matter how inconsistent he becomes. This is how emotional imbalance begins. It is not always intentional cruelty. It is often assumption. An assumption grows stronger every time you stay available without requiring equal effort in return. Let's break down the ego equation in simple terms. When a man feels he has secured your attention, his effort naturally drops. Not because he hates you, but because the challenge in his mind is gone. He starts believing you are predictable, reachable, and always emotionally present. This is similar to how someone treats something they believe they already own. They stop trying to maintain it carefully. In relationships, this shows up as delayed replies, low-effort communication, and emotional distance. The problem is not that you care too much. The problem is that your care is not being matched, and he feels safe doing less while still receiving more. Now let's talk about something very important. His ego weak points. Men often act strong, calm, and emotionally unaffected. But psychologically, there are certain triggers they do not openly show. One of them is the fear of being replaceable. Another is the fear of losing influence over how you feel and respond. And the third is the fear that you are slowly moving on without drama or explanation. When a man senses that you might have other options, or that your emotional dependence is decreasing, something shifts in his awareness. He may not show it immediately, but internally it creates discomfort because it breaks his assumption of control and importance. Before you even think about changing his behavior, you have to stop the habits that accidentally increase his comfort. Many women unknowingly do this by double texting when there is no reply, or by checking in again just to keep the conversation alive. Others try to appear unbothered through social media posts, but still emotionally react the same way in private. And one of the biggest mistakes is giving maximum effort even when he is clearly giving minimum effort. When you continue overgiving, you teach him that consistency is not required from his side. This is where imbalance becomes normal and effort stops being mutual. The real psychological shift happens when you stop announcing your emotional decisions and start changing your behavior quietly. A man does not panic when you threaten to leave or explain your distance in long messages. He adjusts to words easily, but he reacts differently when your actions change without warning. When replies slow down, when you stop initiating, when you stop over-explaining, when your emotional availability becomes less predictable, something inside him starts paying attention again. Not because you became cold, but because the pattern he was comfortable with is no longer guaranteed, and that uncertainty forces awareness. Now his ego starts to react in a deeper way. Men often fear your silence more than your anger, because anger still shows emotional attachment. Silence, on the other hand, feels like distance they can't measure or control. They also fear your calmness more than your tears, because tears still mean you care, but calmness means you are processing things without them. And most of all, they fear your indifference more than rejection, because rejection still gives them closure, while indifference removes their importance completely. Silence sends one clear message in their mind: you are slipping away, and they are no longer able to influence the outcome. At this stage, the focus is not on hurting anyone, but on restoring balance in the dynamic. When a man becomes too comfortable, he stops noticing effort. And when effort is not noticed, it slowly disappears. The idea here is not punishment, but awareness. The goal is to reset the emotional equation so that both sides feel presence, effort, and value again. When you stop reacting emotionally and start responding with calm control, it creates a shift in how he perceives your attention. Instead of feeling secure in a one-sided pattern, he begins to notice that your energy is no longer automatically available. One subtle shift is what can be called the "I didn't notice" energy. Many men expect emotional reactions when they withdraw. They expect questions, double texts, or emotional follow-ups. But when your response is light, delayed, and emotionally neutral, it interrupts that expectation. You reply in your own time, you stay polite but not overly expressive, and you avoid turning his delay into a big emotional event. This sends a quiet message that his absence did not disrupt your life or mood. When a man realizes he did not create emotional disturbance, it challenges his assumption of importance in your daily emotional world. Another shift happens when your personal life visibly improves without announcement or explanation. Instead of reacting to his distance with emotional posts or indirect messages, you simply continue living your life. You focus on yourself, your routine, your growth, your peace, and your environment. Over time, your presence starts to reflect stability instead of reaction. When he sees you calm, active, and socially or personally engaged, it creates curiosity. Not because you are trying to provoke it, but because your emotional state no longer matches his expectation of dependence or waiting. A powerful psychological effect appears when you mirror effort instead of emotion. If his communication becomes slower, you naturally slow yours. If his messages become short, yours become equally simple. If he stops initiating, you also stop forcing conversation. This is not about copying behavior in a childish way, but about matching energy in a balanced way. When a man realizes he is no longer receiving more than he gives, it forces him to reassess the dynamic. It creates a question in his mind about whether he still has automatic access to your attention without effort. Another shift happens when your emotional state remains steady regardless of his behavior. Instead of reacting with frustration, sadness, or over-explaining when he pulls away, you remain composed and consistent. This creates confusion in his expectations. He expects emotional escalation, but instead, he sees emotional control. That contrast is powerful. It removes the assumption that your mood is dependent on his presence. When that assumption breaks, so does his sense of emotional control in the connection. Even simple communication changes, like being briefly unavailable or saying you are busy without over-explaining, can reset dynamics. When he reaches out and you respond calmly that you are occupied or will talk later, without emotional weight or apology, it shifts the sense of priority. It shows that your time is structured, your attention is not constantly open, and your life continues independently of his timing. This is not about playing games, but about reclaiming personal boundaries that were previously blurred by over-accessibility. What is really happening underneath all of this is a psychological reversal. When a man believes he has emotional control over timing and attention, he relaxes his effort. But when that predictability disappears, his mind starts recalculating. He begins to question his assumptions about your availability, your emotional attachment, and your responsiveness. This is where interest often returns, not because you changed who you are, but because the emotional pattern has shifted from predictable to uncertain. Men are drawn to emotional balance that feels warm but not dependent, present but not overwhelming, and interested but not attached in a way that creates pressure. When your energy becomes calm and slightly detached, it activates curiosity. When it becomes stable and non-reactive, it activates self-reflection. And when it no longer reacts strongly to absence, it activates a fear of losing influence in your emotional world. At this point, the internal shift begins. His thoughts move from assuming access to questioning access to trying to regain access. That is the moment where behavior often changes. But the most important part is what you do next. If he returns, you do not fall into old patterns of overreaction or emotional imbalance. You remain steady, warm, and grounded. You do not punish, you do not lecture, and you do not try to extract apologies through emotion. You simply maintain your standards and observe actions, not words. Because real power in dynamics like this is not in controlling someone else's behavior. It is in controlling your own emotional availability. When you stop chasing validation and start holding your own emotional space, everything changes naturally. A man does not fear losing someone who depends on him. He fears losing someone who does not need to chase him, but still chooses him with awareness. And that difference is what changes the entire emotional direction of the connection. When someone starts ignoring you or giving you inconsistent attention, the real issue is usually not just bad behavior. It is a shift in perceived emotional value and access. Human attention naturally follows what feels rewarding, uncertain, or meaningful. In early stages, interest is often high because everything is new and attention feels like a discovery. But over time, if one person becomes too available or too predictable, the other person's brain starts treating that presence as something stable rather than something to be actively earned. That is when effort tends to drop. Not always because feelings are gone, but because the sense of urgency disappears. A lot of emotional confusion comes from this imbalance between attachment and effort. One person may be emotionally invested and actively thinking about the relationship, while the other is engaging only when it feels convenient. This creates a gap where the more invested person starts overanalyzing every delay, every short reply, and every change in tone. But the one who is less invested often does not realize the impact of their behavior because in their mind, things still feel fine, as long as the connection is not fully broken. This mismatch is what creates anxiety, not just distance itself. When people talk about ego in relationships, it is not just about pride. It is more about self-perception and control. If someone feels they have easy access to your attention without effort, they unconsciously relax. They assume your emotional presence is constant. But when that access becomes less automatic, when responses are no longer immediate or emotionally reactive, their brain registers a change. Not necessarily loss of love, but loss of certainty. And uncertainty is one of the strongest triggers for human attention because it forces the mind to reassess value. At the same time, it is important to understand something clearly. The healthiest relationships are not built on psychological tactics or emotional reversals, but on mutual effort. The ideas of pulling away or creating confusion only become relevant when imbalance already exists. If both people are genuinely invested, there is no need for games, silent strategies, or controlled distance. Communication stays natural because both sides are already meeting each other halfway. Problems only start when one person is constantly adjusting while the other is simply reacting. Emotional withdrawal can sometimes make someone notice your absence, but it does not guarantee respect, love, or long-term change. What it often does is reveal existing interest levels. If someone values the connection, they will naturally adjust and show more consistency when they sense distance. If they are only partially invested, they may show temporary attention but not sustained effort. That distinction matters more than any short-term reaction you get from changing your behavior. A key pattern in human behavior is that people respond more strongly to loss than to presence. When something feels stable, it fades into the background of attention. When it feels uncertain or less accessible, the mind pays more attention to it again. But emotional maturity is what decides whether someone responds to that realization by improving consistency or simply reacting temporarily and then returning to old habits. That is why watching actions over time matters more than any momentary shift. Another important point is that trying to manage someone's attention too much often creates emotional exhaustion. Constantly adjusting your tone, timing, or behavior just to trigger a reaction can slowly disconnect you from your own emotional stability. The more you focus on how to make someone notice you, the less you focus on whether their behavior is actually suitable for your peace. And that is where many people lose clarity, because they start chasing engagement instead of evaluating compatibility. Real emotional balance comes when your attention is not dependent on someone else's unpredictability. It is not about becoming cold or distant, but about not letting inconsistency control your internal state. When you are grounded in your own life, your reactions become smaller, your expectations become clearer, and your boundaries become stronger. That naturally changes how others treat you, because people tend to adjust their behavior around those who are not easily pulled into emotional instability. In the end, the most important shift is internal. Instead of asking why someone is not responding the way you want, the deeper question becomes whether their level of effort matches what you actually need. If it does not, no amount of waiting, withdrawing, or reacting will create lasting consistency. And if it does, there is no need for psychological strategies at all, because mutual effort naturally maintains itself without force or confusion. So let me leave you with this. When someone is inconsistent with you, the real message is not hidden in their words, it is in their effort. You do not need to overthink silence, delayed replies, or emotional distance. These things simply reveal how much priority you hold in their actions, not in their potential. And that difference is where clarity begins. You do not gain peace by chasing attention. And you do not gain respect by lowering your standards. You gain both when you stop reacting to confusion and start observing behavior as it is, not as you hope it could be. The moment you remove overthinking and emotional guessing, you start seeing things more clearly and decisions become easier. The strongest position you can be in is not emotional intensity, but emotional stability. When you stay calm, grounded, and consistent with your own life, you stop being affected by unpredictability. And that is when your focus returns to what actually matters: mutual effort, mutual respect, and mutual presence. At the end of the day, the right connection does not require you to question your worth, decode silence, or fight for basic attention. It simply feels steady, balanced, and clear. And anything outside of that is not something you fix by trying harder, but something you recognize and step back from with self-respect.